So Nathan Hayden, we're so fortunate to have him here. I talked a little bit about him at the opening reception, but I've known Nathan's work only for about a year or so now. But every piece I'd seen was really impressive to me. And so when we were at a studio, I just said, do what you want with our gallery, and he did what he did. And some people have said to me, well, wasn't that a big risk to do that? And I never feel that way about working with artists. I think if you kind of trust them, they're going to do their best. And people, at least in our galleries, always really perform to the top. They just go out of their way, and he certainly did. He worked on this show for weeks and many, many hours to put this show together for us. So it's a great joy to have this in the gallery and out into the deck. I was saying to somebody, he's filled up both of these spaces, but at the end of the show, we could take it all and put it in a box about this big, right? Because it's just yarn and wire. It's an interesting idea, that expansive notion of line and space. Nathan grew up in Kentucky. West Virginia, near a state park, in a log cabin. Spent a lot of time outdoors in the natural world. Was drawing, doing wood carving very early on. And I think if you keep that in mind when you think about this show, you'll see some relationships between those shapes and the sort of organic world. This show has been reviewed 3 places already. Our own student newspaper, which has 24 images online about the show, and in the Independent, and in Joe Woodard's recent review last Friday. Joe Woodard took on the aspect of the show that nobody else has, about the dark side of the show, because the show is called Some Are Sweet
and Some Are Nasty.
And Some Are Nasty.
Yeah.
And some people don't see any nastiness in there, they just see joy. I think it's an interesting take on the 70s move forward, and I say that because he's, an age difference here that he could be like my son, so I kind of relate to his parents in a way. And I see the fruition of ideas that were floating around at that time being moved forward by what he's doing here. And also the use of the materials that at that time we were just beginning to use in the feminist art movement's use of, yarn in space. Well, so we've come full circle now that men are using this material, and we've sort of, everything's got advanced, and now it's taken this whole new step here. So for me, to watch this happen is really a joyful thing. It shows you how art always advances and always builds on what it's the past, whether it knows what it's building upon. It just keeps moving forward into the culture. So I'm very pleased to have him in the gallery, and I'm pleased to have him here to talk with us. Nathan Hayden.
You would just try to maybe keep that image up there. We were supposed to have a remote keyboard, which doesn't seem to work, so this might be a little bit of an acrobatic lecture here, which makes it a little more exciting. First of all, I'd like to thank Dane for giving me the shot at this amazing space. It's really a gem right here in Santa Barbara, and I think we're all really lucky to have the Atkinson Gallery in this community. So thank you for also letting me do what I wanted to do, which is not always the case when working with other people. Dane basically just said, you got the gallery and you can do whatever you want. I asked if I could go on the roof. He said yes, no problem. I asked if I could do stuff outside. He said yes, no problem. Can I drill into the ceiling? Yes, no problem. And what more can you ask for? I would also like to thank people that helped me on this project. And there was no small amount of help put into this project. Xavier Valerio, who's an undergrad at UCSB, put in some hours. Shane Talbert, who is a graduate student with me, put in some hours working on it, and also came with me one day and brainstormed on the project. Melissa Silver put in some hours. Hunter Rose Vainstein put in many hours, probably the most of anyone. So a big, big hand to her. Who am I forgetting? Stephanie Washburn came by, who's also a graduate student, put in some hours. So as you can see, there were many people who had hands in this, and I would not have been able to take it to the level that it was taken to without them. Lastly, I am thankful for something that Dane was talking about, which is I was born with something of a gift, and I'm not talking about my artistic abilities. I'm talking about I got a pretty good myth from the get-go, which Dane mentioned a little bit, but I'm going to go a little bit more into detail because I think it does give some background to the work that I'm going to show tonight. The first thing is I am the son of dropouts. My parents were part of that whole generation that didn't like going to school and thought that maybe they could learn more by doing other things. So my mom dropped out of a performing arts high school in Brooklyn, New York, the same one where Fame was filmed. My dad dropped out of the Boston School of Architecture. They were both hanging out at the time in upstate New York. My dad was hanging out with friends who were making belts, I'm told. And they were selling these belts at a small state or county fair. And my mom was kind of a camp counselor at some sort of summer camp or something of the sort. She was at the same fair, and they met and they fell in love. So my dad came down to visit with my mom in New York, and my grandparents, who are moderately conservative on the Democratic conservatives, is there such a thing? They're Democrats, but like they're clean-cut Democrats, and they didn't like my dad at all because he looked like a bum, you know. He had the long hair and the long beard and the patchwork bell-bottom jeans and the whole nine. So they were like, no, you can't hang out with him. And she was like, yes, I want to hang out with him. So they took off, and her parents and my grandparents, in a way, sort of disowned her for a while. But she took advantage of that time, and they hitchhiked across the country a couple of times and ended up in Guyana, New Mexico, which from pictures looks like one of the most remote places on the face of the planet. It's south of Santa Fe. It was on top of a mesa, about 7,000 feet, nothing around at all. And they lived there for about 5 years in a house that they bought, which some other people may not refer to so much as a house. It was beer cans held together with mud. Yeah, recycling. And I'm told that they went back and visited recently. I didn't get an opportunity to go, but I'm told that it's still standing and in fair shape. So they lived there, and they built onto it a little bit. More beer cans. And they lived there for about 5 years. And that was where they ended up conceiving me. But they did not decide to have me there because it was cold and windy and there was nothing around. So they decided to move to another remote place, which was a little closer to back east. West Virginia. Yeah, I had some questions when I found out about that move. But so they moved there in hopes of being a little closer because by this time her and her parents had somewhat reconciled. So I was born in West Virginia at Grantsville State Hospital, something like that. A hospital. I was the only one of the 3 kids born in a hospital. I have a younger brother and sister, both born at home. I was born there, and so for the first 8 years of my life, I lived behind Cedar Creek State Park in Gilmer County, West Virginia. And it was far back in the woods, far enough that you had to walk for about a mile to get to the house from the car. So, and there was some sort of standing shelter there when they moved there, which was enough for us to live in until my dad built a log cabin, which is where We lived from the time I was about 2.5 onwards. During that time, I think that a lot of people's imagination, when I tell them about this, goes a little bit wild, like, wow, 8 years in the woods, that must have been great. At the time, it wasn't so great to me. I was terribly bored. There was nothing to do. There was nobody around to play with. And so I spent a lot of my time running around in the woods and playing in the creek. I'm told that at a very early age, I actually got lost in the woods. And I like to think that I can remember this, though I feel that it's more the memories of other people that have told me the story than it is my own memory. But I feel that I remember the first time I went to the creek that was near my house, and it was late spring, early summer. And my memory is of the grass and how green and lush it was, and the water and how cool it was. And I think it was that sort of lushness and coolness that kept me coming back to the creek. So I spent a lot of time there, and I spent a lot of time there looking at the creatures that lived under the rocks, of which there were many. So what I'm doing is sort of building a foundation for my interest in biology. I think that's a lot of where it came from. So at the age of 8, my parents decided to move to Ohio upon request of my mom, because the place where we lived was just a little too remote. And being from New York, she needed some interaction with humankind, I guess. So we moved to Athens, Ohio, which was a compromise because there's a school there around the same size as UCSB, Ohio University. And lived also kind of out in the country outside of town, but lived there. Take a swig of water here. And so I hadn't gone to school at this time. And I was 8. So there were certain problems when it came to reading and writing. The main problem being that I couldn't do it yet. But I was acclimated in other ways. I knew how to identify trees by looking at their bark, and I knew most of the local trees. I knew what you can eat in the wild, and I knew how to identify birds. So this is what I had at the time. Basically, my parents did not make me go to school. They just gave me the opportunity to go to school if I wanted to. Eventually, I decided that school might be a good idea because there were other kids at school and I could hang out with them. So I went, and I found it fairly hard to deal with at first because, well, for someone who's had no opportunity to really interact with kids much, and then going into a public school in a sort of Appalachian part of the world, there's sort of somewhat of a very small culture clash between the counterculture hippie child and the sort of more local agrarian people that inhabited the region. So I slowly learned to read and write, and I went through school, and by about the time I was in the 5th grade, I was fairly well acclimated and developed interests in, surprisingly enough, science, which was probably my favorite subject, and I thought I was going to be a scientist for quite some time in my life. It was one of those kid things that you want to do. But I also got very into English literature, mathematics, and what other one did I want to add in there? Art. I stayed interested in art too. I always drew, and it wasn't until after graduating high school at the age of 20 that I decided that I was going to be an artist. And so I enrolled at Miami University, which is a state school in Ohio, and I decided that it was time to do just that. So I started to make stuff very intensely, and I'd always drawn, but never thought of it as something that I would do all of the time for the rest of my life, basically, until about that time. The thing with the place where I went, Miami, was it didn't have a specific sort of installation field, or like a field that was not just two-dimensional or three-dimensional. And I was very interested in something that was outside of just painting and drawing or just sculpting in wood or whatever. So I was constantly going back and forth between the two during that time, which kind of brings us up to speed with where I'm going to start talking about my work. I'm going to start with when I graduated from Miami University, which was a very productive time for me. Because at that time, I was lucky enough to graduate with just a little bit of money in my pocket. I had a few $1,000s, and this was at the beginning of the O's, back when our exchange rate with Canada was really quite good. So I cashed in my American dollars for Canadian dollars, and I went to Toronto for about 6 months. And I got a little apartment, and I didn't know anyone in the city. And I just lived and worked and worked and worked and worked. I would work 12 hours a day, no problem. And no one was to bother me because I didn't have any friends. I didn't know anybody. So I would spend small parts of the day walking around the city and sort of recording things that I wanted to make art about. And then I would go home and I would draw about it. So sorry that I have to have my back to you for a second here, but I'm going to go to that point in the slides and show you some slides from that period. Or I guess they were slides until I turned them into digital images. All right. So as you can see, I keep coming back to things that could be possibly microscopic. Also, being someone that worked with science quite a bit, things that possibly are coming through the glass under a microscope, so there's light coming up through them, kind of. These are all pen and ink on paper. As I came out of school, actually this is a painting, but most of the ones that I have in here are drawings. As I came out of school, drawing was the easiest because you could carry a lot of it around. So it was my intention to make an installation out of all of this stuff. But I wanted to make little pieces with which to make a big installation. So the first thing I did is made a lot of these drawings. This is the first installation I did with that. And what happened is after the first 6 months of being in Toronto, I started to run out of money. And I was looking for a place in the States that was a mid-sized city. Let me get out of your way so you can look at that while I describe this. Where I could live and work very cheaply and not have to have a full-time job was basically my aim. Because after not working any job at all and making a lot of work, I wanted to continue that. So I had a friend who I knew in school, and she had just moved back to her hometown of Louisville, Kentucky. And I had a few places in mind, and Louisville was one of them. So I called her up and asked if I could crash on her couch while I got my shit together in Louisville for a little while. And I went down there and did just that and set up shop there and got a nice little apartment, which I paid like $300 for a month. Yeah, around here it sounds obscene, doesn't it? You can't even get a garage for that. And I continued to make work. I only worked 3 days a week, and I did not live on a lot of money, but I came across a collective gallery, which is in Louisville, and it's still there. It's called Zephyr Gallery. It's been running for 20 years or so, over 20 years now, and one of the longest running collectives around. And they were just starting a program where they would give a young artist a chance to put on a show after a year of serving the gallery, which meant you had to come to meetings and decide certain things about other people's shows, help put other people's shows up, and sit in the gallery once a week. So, pretty good deal. So I put this show together. This is on the bottom, an excessively touching display of attempts in communication. And the way that I was sort of thinking about the string at this time was just the beginning of my relationship with it. And at the time, it was more just a way to hang the cards or the pictures. That way people could look at them all together and not so much in a linear fashion. So you have some that are sort of linear around the room, but then this bunch in the middle, and the path that people would take through that was a little bit more arbitrary, and I liked that idea a lot. So at first, it was just a hanging mechanism, really. But when I built it, I noticed that I quite liked the way that it hung, and the play between the string and gravity was very interesting to me. So these are some more examples of the drawings that I was doing at that time in Toronto and then Louisville. So I don't know which are from where, but
These are all roughly postcard size?
most of these little ones are smaller even, and I will show you some bigger ones as well. It's all ink on paper, these ones, and then I have, I'll call it out, ink on paper, ink on paper, ink on paper. Okay, let's escape. I'll give you a little bit of a... All right, so I'm looking at sort of the way that all of this stuff is hanging together and thinking about that. And sort of devising in my mind the next thing that I want to do, because all the installations that I'm about to show you sort of led from one to the next. And also I was doing paintings at the time. These are acrylic on canvas. At the time, everything was trapezoidal. And I like to tell people at various art events that trapezoids were the future of art, because it's a funny thing to say. And my thinking was that if I put trapezoids on the wall, it would sort of bend the wall a little bit. It doesn't hurt that the walls at the gallery were not exactly straight, as you can see by the bottom of the slide there. So sometimes you get a little help. So those are all acrylic on canvas, and then this is more ink on paper. Just sort of.
Slow down, we're enjoying this.
I'll slow down on some of them. I don't want to take too long. And also, many of them have language. This was the time when I began to do a lot of language play here. This one is in there backwards, but it's whippoorwill. Yeah. One of the benefits that I had at Miami University was they had a really good art and architecture library. So I'd spend a lot of my time just looking at books, because I didn't have a lot of access, unfortunately, to art outside of the small town where the university was. So. This one is very, speaking of optimistic, it says, "Glad to see you here." It's optimistic, right? It was my first week in Toronto. Another, I think, interesting sort of clash of worlds was when I was about 5. My parents took me on a trip to see my grandparents, who lived in New York City still. So I had an early experience going to New York and seeing that, which was quite a different landscape, obviously. All right. The next thing that happened to me in Louisville was I did this group show, and the reason that I did the group show basically was to just have a chance at doing something in this space. The group show is loosely themed with machines. Machines was loosely the theme. Machines were loosely the theme. The idea was that we'd make a big show that was all about machines, and my work I didn't really think was particularly about machines, but I did want to do the show because the space was amazing, and I'll show you a big. So this is a place called the Water Tower. Which is also in Louisville, and it was the old city water building, and it's an incredible space. You have these banisters, which there's a spiral staircase on the other side of the room that leads up to this walkway, which goes around the space, maybe 20, 25 feet up, and then it's a huge dome ceiling that's maybe 50 or so feet high. And so I really wanted to do a project that hung from this entire thing. And I didn't have a lot of time to get it together, and so I was looking for things that I could hang off of them, and didn't want to show my same drawings over and over again, so, and especially in the same town. So what I came up with was trying to find little machine parts, which were reminiscent to me of the shapes that were in many of my drawings, one thing that I'd always enjoyed doing as a child was taking things apart just to see what they were made of. So this gave me an opportunity to do that. And what it did consequently is sort of give me a tiny glimpse into the future of what I would make, I think, because this was a little bit out of the realm of what I was thinking about, because it didn't have the drawings, but it gave me ideas about maybe getting rid of the drawings in the future. So it was a little bit of an anomaly at the time. So anyway, I got all these little machine parts that I thought looked sort of like things that you would find in my drawings, and I made this big cone thing that comes down into the space. And it was with a bunch of other stuff, which I was not particularly fond of, except for a few pieces by artists that I like. But it gave me a chance to use the space, and then they took all of their stuff out, and I photographed it real quick. And so it just looks like a big solo show. This is all string and all held together by gravity, which was my primary concern at the time. Sort of the functioning of organic forms that hang and sort of hold together through gravity alone. There you can see. It was quite ornamental. And then we cut it down. My friend who photographs some of my shows, Sarah Lyon, still lives in Louisville, and she has such a great eye. Look at these people here. So we cut it down all the way around, and then we left 2 strings just holding the whole thing up on opposite sides of the place, and both cut them at the same time, and that is exactly as it fell. I think it's kind of amazing. So then had the opportunity to work with my partner at the time on a show that we did at U of L's gallery. And I went back to drawing. Oops. little too far. But I was concerned with just making things that sort of looked the same in style. And I've always thought it would be fun that if you could make sort of something that had the same ideas in it, but maybe didn't get so stuck on just the style of it. So the sort of, I don't know exactly what I was going for with the sort of MC Escher, very tightly rendered lines, but there was something that seemed to me about it that wasn't quite what I wanted to do. It seemed a little bit too tight, and it didn't have enough energy in it, I felt. And I felt that maybe making things cartoon-like for a while might do that. And I'm not sure if it actually did or not, but that's what I did for a long time. So for the next show, I worked with sort of this cartoon style and made all of these, which are mostly made with only 2 colors of wash, and it's acrylic wash and pen and ink on paper. And one thing that it sort of made me do, I think, is draw a little bit more like how the wire functions in this show that I did at Atkinson Gallery. So the line being just one line and sort of following the form, I think, is the start of me thinking about making these drawings 3-dimensional. If anyone has questions as we go, please.
How big are those?
Some of these are a little bigger than the last ones, maybe like 12 by 18 inches, like this one would be, something like in that ballpark. It's about a foot.
What did you do with the string from the machines when you were done with them?
I saved it for future projects. A lot of them I would make into little, like sculptural hangy things and give them to friends and such. These are paintings with the red and the green. So I'm sort of just isolating the color down to just red and green, so I don't let too much color in at once. Sort of just as a exercise and restraint. This time the painting's hanging the other way, so it curves in the opposite. Also did some sculptures. These are tinfoil with it's industrial strength tinfoil with some sort of acrylic resin over it. And they end up looking kind of like ceramics, but also me starting to think about sculpture again.
Is it solid tinfoil or just wrapped around foil?
Actually, the middle of them are cardboard boxes filled with plastic bags as a core. Cheap materials. No shortage of plastic bags and cardboard boxes.
Nathan, your work seems so labor-intensive, even in these little drawings. That I know in the gallery, it's obvious how labor-intensive that was, but these also have that feeling of just a lot of time and focus. Is that the case?
It is quite a bit the case, and the thing that I'm continue to try to do, which I think you can kind of see in this progression, is as I go, I'm progressively getting looser in my drawing and more mobile. So what I'm going to show later will show you kind of how I've made that progression. At this time, they're getting a little bit more loose. I'm basically taping them off in my sketchbook and carrying that around wherever, so whenever I have an extra hour of waiting somewhere or whatever, I can get them out and work on them. but they're still pretty tight at this point, even though they're cartoon. So I made this at U of L, and it's basically, when I made the cone at the last one, I thought, well, I could just drop the middle out of it and make one continuous like form, and that would be fun. I'm still not entirely sure how successful I think this one is, although it led me to some really, I think, more interesting things. The thing that I think is the problem with this one is the form and the drawings. Neither one is sort of taking on the role of being in a hierarchy, sort of one more important than the other. It's kind of competing for attention. So you sort of... These are just some pictures of the ones. I went back to black and white, and here for this period I just kind of don't even know what I'm doing. I'm just drawing to try to get somewhere else, and when I usually do that, I usually go back to black and white. So I made a bunch of these just before I came to school, and they were all sort of had a sort of science fiction element to them. I think that one was kind of good. And this is the summer just before I went back to grad school. So this is actually the very first drawing that I made when I came here. And at this point, I'd like to talk a little bit about reasons to go to grad school. I'm talking to you as a grad student, soon to no longer be a grad student. And so I was kind of just making these drawings over and over again, but didn't feel like I was really going anywhere too much, and really wanted some time to figure out how to build something that went beyond just a drawing. So I had ideas, as I said before, from that other show that I did in Louisville about sort of making the drawings in space. And so one of the things that I wrote to come to grad school to do was to try to figure out how to do that. I think the best thing about going back to school is there are so many amazing people around that you can really get a lot of ideas from. So I think that if I was going to say there's one reason to go back to school, it's just to be in sort of a big soup of ideas. So I made these, and I'm getting really tight again, and then I went back to school. And as soon as I got to school, I was offered a show down in Manhattan Beach, which is just south of LA. And it was a really good deal, so I sort of couldn't pass it up. I got this whole space, which was a really big space, and I was completely funded to do it, which is amazing at this point in my life. It doesn't happen very often. Plus, I had someone who was a paid full-time assistant, so I didn't have to beg my friends to come help me, which was, it's a nice liberty. So I made this show, and this is the Manhattan Beach Project. And here is the first time that I've consciously said, okay, I'm going to take the drawings and I'm going to do one thing with them, and I'm going to take the string and I'm going to do another thing with them. So in this space there are two skylights, and I decided to make a big sculptural hanging thing in the space, which basically comes down from the skylight, and then there's like a tail, which you can't see real well in that picture, that leads up to this other skylight in the front. And then I did all of these starbursts with what I'm now calling the cards, which are these little pieces of paper that I carry around in my pocket. And on them, I quickly jot pictures of things that are interesting to me, textures, plant forms, machine parts, whatever, and things that I overhear. And it could be anything from overheard cell phone conversations to things that friends maybe have said to me. And so there are lots of them, and they're still growing. I'm still doing them, and they're sort of the newest incarnation of my drawing. And I think they're much more successful because I feel like they're a lot more about the ideas than just about rendering this super tight, really technically perfect drawing, which I think is a little boring maybe. So you have the super tight technical drawing and then all of the cards on the outside. And my idea was, since it is the Manhattan Beach project, to make something of a blast. So the cards sort of blast out from the center. And there are also a couple of acrylic paintings that I made when I came here, which are pretty large, 8 by 6 feet paintings. So I'm just making things big because I have the space, basically.
Nathan, did you ever study like fishnet making or basket weaving or some sort of pattern to your string structures?
I did not. I started using the pattern, which is sort of the radiating spiral thing, which connects on a grid. When I saw the lotus flower start to be used by BP, and it pissed me off. I was like, I don't like that BP is using the lotus flower. I'm going to use the lotus flower. And so, but I just started drawing it, and I just, it's such a pattern that you can really drape over anything. And yeah. So, and it just led me to be able to sculpt forms out of that pattern. And the other pattern that I use a lot is really just a grid, although an imperfect grid at that. Then I decided to depart because really that first show was kind of a culmination of all the things that I'd been making outside of grad school plus one little step. But I felt like I needed to take a big step. So that big step for me was to purchase a couple of spinning wheels off of eBay, which came to me all the way from the Netherlands. And I thought that it might be fun to make my own string, because then I could put stuff in the string and make it more personal. And so I got these spinning wheels and learned with some friends how to spin wool off of watching YouTube videos. And at this time, there was a woman who was a student at CCS, and her daughter was going to Cal Poly for some sort of farming sciences and took care of sheep. So there was tons of wool to be had. So I cheaply purchased a couple of garbage bags full of that off of her. And we went to town and spun all this wool to make this project, which I did for my first year review. And this is the center of what I was sort of attempting to make a little bit like a spaceship form, but I think it ended up looking more like a basketball net. And then I did this big sort of hypnotic sort of shrine to all these masks I was making. And all of the strings come down and make this triangle, so there's like kind of a room you can stand in when you look at the center of this thing. What I sort of realized doing this piece was that I'd really made two pieces and sort of jammed them together. So it should have just been that, I think, as one piece, and then the wool thing as the other piece. So that led me to start actually making drawings in space. Dane asked me to do this show at the end of the summer, and I came and I saw the space. It's an incredible space. I mean, everybody's went and has seen it. It just was like the perfect size that I felt like I could fill it with a drawing in space. So I was making these things. I put one outside to see how it looked. I had this great sort of communication with the trees and like this white fuzzy flower in the front. And I thought that it should be sort of floral and kind of jungly in there. So it's really me just doing things to try to think about different ways of approaching the space. Those were some drawings that I was abandoning. And then I came into the space. I made all of the forms, or most of them, during last quarter and over the break primarily. And then we brought them in. It took 2 weeks. It was about 12 hours a day for me, and then all the time that people that came to help contributed as well. And just put these images in, but really we should just go down and look at the show. Some ideas that I started to really think about in the show were how to sort of think about people actually being in the space as part of the drawing. So it becomes a different drawing in space when people enter the space. Some of it is, but it is a combination of yarn that I've made, and then some yarn that I've bought, and then some synthetic stuff that I've bought as well. And the wire is all rebar tie wire.
Is this your first time using the wire?
Yeah. This is the first time using the wire. One of the things that I was hoping for with the wire, and is very successful on the outdoor piece, is it rusts, especially when it's in the rain for a couple of weeks straight like it has been. And so the one outside, I think, has changed a lot and for the better.
Could you talk about color?
Well, color I'd been approaching rather gingerly up to this point, and I felt it was time to just open it up to just about everything. I did sort of stay with colors that were sort of in the pink-orange spectrum, and then on the other side, sort of the green spectrum. And I was my thinking there, just as a jumping-off point, was sort of plant and animal, like blood and guts, and then like green of plants, but like sort of heightened to some sort of strange toxic capacity. Most of the yarn that I made is like the light stuff. So most of it's just raw wool. Anyway. I think that's the... We'll end where we started. Oh, sorry.
Nathan, what brought you to Santa Barbara, and why did you apply to UCSB?
That is actually a bit of a story. I applied to grad school twice. The first time I applied to schools, I got into a school down in LA called Otis College of Art and Design, which is a fine school, but it cost about $1 billion. And I didn't have $1 billion at the time and didn't really want to spend $1 billion. So I said, I'll defer, I'll see if I can get another deal maybe, and things of that nature. At the same, circa the same time, there was a man who was a curator named Julian Robeson, who was at the Speed Art Museum at the time as the contemporary art curator. And he had followed my work while I was in Louisville and brought all kinds of very interesting, brilliant lecturers to Louisville, including Colin Gardner, who's here in the audience. So I went and saw him talk, and this was just a little bit after I had been in a little show in LA. And it just happened that also in the show was Eric Beltz, who's a lecturer at UCSB, and Jane Callister and Phil Argent were down to support them, and they saw my work, and they were like talking to me, and I was telling them my sob story about how I didn't want to spend $1 billion on grad school, and they were like, oh, look into UCSB. So then when I saw Colin, I put those two things together. I was like, UCSB is great. I like these people a lot. And so it seemed like a really good place to apply. So when I applied to the second rounds, I applied to UCSB. I was very fortunate to get a wonderful deal to come here, and it's been a really great place to make work for the last couple of years. Other questions?
Could you discuss the title of your show?
Summer Sweet and Summer Nasty? Usually when I title a show, I like it to be something that's moderately open-ended. Summer Sweet and Summer Nasty actually came from the little cards that I make. When Getchi Mutu, who's an artist, came to UCSB and to give a talk, and she did some studio visits. And she came to my studio, and I was lucky to talk to her because she had some very smart things to say. And she really was digging on the cards, and she said, oh, I really like these. Some are sweet and some are nasty. Of course, I wrote it down on a card, and I sometimes read back through the cards to see if there's anything good in there. And I kept coming back to that, and when I got the show, it just seemed like it would fit with the idea, because there's all these different forms, and it sort of gives them some personality, I guess. Yes?
Talk about the process of making your drawings. Do you kind of plan it out, or do you just kind of focus on your paper and go for it?
That's changed a lot since those first ones. Those first ones that were sort of black and white grayscale, I showed the ones that I had made in Toronto and the beginning of my time at Louisville. When I was doing those, I was planning them out very much, which is sort of how the cards got started, because I was going out on little walks, and I would collect stuff on just little pieces of paper, which at the time I didn't call the cards at all. And I would collect all of this information, and then I would bring it back and lay it out on my bed, my little apartment, and look at it and sort of, in my mind, think of different connections that I could make. And that was how I sort of built these drawings. And then from there, I would make a pencil sketch. No, I didn't even do a pencil sketch, but I'd draw very lightly in pen and then sort of build it up, and it would change as I drew over it. Now, I don't really plan them out so much. I just think of something that I really want to draw and do it, and it's a much more direct process, and I think it makes for much more quirky, interesting drawings to just kind of...
No other questions? Hopefully, been clear.
I'll ask a question. You said this is your first time working with wire, or the first time you had an exhibit that was wire?
First time that I've worked with wire, yeah.
Was this exhibit?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Well, I mean, it was a slow start. I mean, I only probably made 2 out of all of those forms. Only finished maybe 2 in the last semester. But then, I mean, this is another great thing about school is you can really just bury yourself for a little while sometimes. You get these little breaks in doing other things, and you can just really zero in on what you want to do, and you'd be surprised at how far you can go with any material if you just...
How did you like it?
I like certain aspects of it because it's hard to make it perfectly straight, and I think the sort of jiggliness of it is akin to the way that I'm drawing now, much more loose. I sometimes draw with my left hand just to get a more shaky line. Sometimes I draw on the bus just to get a more shaky line. And I think that the wire really lends itself to getting that sort of vibrancy or energy in the line. So I like it for that reason. But it's a little hard on the hands. Yeah. Especially since over the break the heat wasn't working in our studios. Just laying on a cold floor and trying to bend cold, greasy wire. Yeah.
What percentage of those early pen and ink on paper drawings were executed prior to any of your schooling or training?
Oh, those ones I showed, they were all after after being at Miami. And Miami is primarily like traditional, like lots of figure drawing, lots of still life drawing. And I sort of tend to think that it's really good to have a base of that, just so you know how people were putting things together in the past, but then also have some people around that say, are there to tell you like things don't have to be put together that way. There are many other ways, and some of which have not yet been discovered. So I would go for schools that have that.
What made you choose art over science? Did you say you like those?
That's a good question. I'm not entirely sure. I think it may have just came down to that art seemed more exciting to me. It was more of an adventure, because scientific experiments are so sort of, they're a little bit more like my early drawings. They're very tight. It's like you are looking for some sort of desired effect, and you have a few variables, and you just stick to those variables, and you're trying to get that. If you're a good scientist, you'll be looking for little variations that maybe you weren't expecting, which is kind of, I think, more what art is about, is really opening yourself up to those little variations or little things that you're not expecting to happen when you're making stuff.
Quick one. With a very apparent progression of work, where do you see yourself going next? What kind of materials that maybe you haven't used yet? Do you see yourself venturing in the future with new things?
Yeah. One thing that is really starting to be interesting to me is seeing making these things as a performance, because I think that people are about as interested in them as they ever are while I'm actually building them. That's when people really want to see like what's going on, and it's also really, I think, interesting for people to see the progression of sort of these things laying on the floor, and they're kind of deflated, and it doesn't look good, and things are off, and then it sort of gets raised up, and it looks all different, and that's exciting, and that process, I think, is more exciting to people and myself than actually even the finished or the beginning of the process, is that sort of middle area. So what I want to do is propose to places that I actually come in, and the entire show is me installing, and the piece isn't finished until right at the end, and then cut it down. It's very dramatic.
Have you filmed any of your installations? Like, set a camera up and you just go to work in the space and then look at the...
I haven't done that yet, but it's on my list of things to do.
Stop motion.
Yeah, stop motion. Yeah. It's all good ideas. I like it. It just has to be done.
Do you have any cards in your pocket?
Yeah. Do you wanna? They were busy doing angel dust and having fun.
At the LA Art Fair 2 weeks ago, they had a section of it for graduate students from like UC San Diego, Claremont Graduate School, UCSB. I'm trying to think of all the others, like 5 or 6 schools,
Yeah,
and students like him had their works. So it's a great opportunity to have their work seen in relation to the traditional art fair. And what he had in the show was a binder, page, of these drawings just sitting on the table. And nobody else was doing anything else like this big, expansive thing. This was so intimate, you just sat there and just flip through them like somebody's scrapbook. Well, anybody else here? Thanks so much for a great lecture. Really appreciate it.